So, Alcine, as I am in the room with you today, and we had just finished recording last week's episode. We love spending time together, and we were just having this conversation and suddenly realized, hey, this topic will be great. So we decided to stay longer and
hit record.
So here we are again. And so if you haven't listened to last week, we were talking about, the beginning of the year and how we're expecting great things for 2025 and what that could look like in each of our worlds personally.
That's right, because you shared that it's the year of the Jubilee.
Yep.
And then, what does that mean for us, though? How are we going to show up and expect for 2025? And that got us talking about our family and our home life and our lives, for this year. And we just realised, you know what? It all starts in the home.
Yeah.
If we're expecting great things for 2025, it has to start in the home. And so that means our closest relationships and, typically our spouse. Or,
And for you and me it is. For you and me it's our spouse. We're both in the stage of life where our kids are grown up. You've still got a few kids
at home.
And my hubby and I, we're an empty nest. And so, the relationship with, if you are listening and you haven't a significant other in your world, that is a really good relationship to be intentional about, what is your role in making this conversation, this relationship really great and the year a great year.
Yeah.
And
because I think it's fair to say it would be really hard to have a really great 2025 if there's a lot of trouble in your closest relationship.
For sure.
That's your day in, day out. Yeah. And we know in relationship it takes great intentionality. If we just show up here, there, and whenever, however we feel like it with our best friends, we've got to be intentional to have good
Absolutely.
friends.
And that the converse is also true, because if that a close relationship, and if you're listening and you don't have a significant other, maybe it's a close friend, like who's the closest people in your world.
Yeah.
And when those relationships are going well, then even when challenges come and we've got to navigate like tricky things, having those significant others in our world in a really season of a good place in your relationship makes it so much easier.
It really does make it so much easier. And when things are going difficult, to have those people in your world to help give insight and perspective and energy. I've got this one friend who she's like, hey, Al, how's it going? And I'll say, really good. And she goes, no, your eyes are telling a different story. I'm like, oh. But, that's our close relationships. They know us. They know us well. And yet sometimes we forget to be really intentional with those relationships. And I think it's a great conversation to have.
For sure, and especially, if you are married, your significant other, or, because they are there day in and day out. And it's so easy to because we're often not in switched on mode, as you were saying. We're like in a relaxed mode and we really, we can be our true self. And and sometimes we can be the worst versions of ourselves with those who we love the dearest, and as closest. So what does it look like to be intentional about your relationship with your hubby, Elle?
That's a really good question. What does it look like? I just think how much our relationship, our marriage has changed and evolved. It's been 27 years this year. Been together, I think, 30 years. So that's just phenomenal for me. And, I just think, things have changed.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and, if my husband, said something that I didn't agree with, the tears had come, or, I'd be cross and I'd say something back that I shouldn't say, or, and just the way it has evolved now, it's quite fascinating. Like, think back the early years. And I remember one time I had been listening to Joyce Meyer one time, and I was particularly cranky with my husband. I can't remember why or what had happened.
Yeah.
And I had remembered I'd heard something from Joyce, and she was saying she had to shove a towel in her mouth to stop herself from talking. And I remember being so cranky with my husband and shoving something in my mouth so I wouldn't say what I really felt. And, the ebbs and flows in a relationship and in a marriage, and whether it's a marriage or whether it's with your closest friend, there are good seasons, there are tough seasons, but through it all, we want to be intentional to show up and be our authentic self and allow that person to be their authentic self.
And also, the challenge with that sometimes is our authentic self is quite prickly. And like not the best version of ourselves as well.
No.
And I think it's the awareness of, back to what we were saying, if we want to position ourselves and what part do we play in making 2025 great, it's another way to ask that question is what part can we play in fostering really good relationships with those closest to us. And you and I both know from all the coaching space we've worked in is, we want most to change the other person.
Well, because it's easy sometimes to see. Isn't it funny? You can often see problems in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves.
Yeah. And I remember, you saying how your relationship has evolved and we're the same. And I remember in those early days, sometimes being quite reactive, and especially when the kids were little and, I'm trying to figure out who I even am and I don't even know who I am and, you're tired. And I remember being really cranky at Greg once and I almost remember knowing as the words were coming out how ridiculous I was being, but like I couldn't put a stop. I didn't want to put a stop to it. The words just kept coming. And I remember he just looked at me and he just shook his head, turned around and walked off, which made me even more cranky. Like, how dare you walk away? But in hindsight, that was probably the wisest thing he could do in that space, because unfortunately, once those words are out, it's really difficult to
You can't take them back in. Isn't it interesting? And something that I've noticed in our relationships is how easy it is that when we start to see things we don't like in the other person. Because, look, we all know we can't change another person, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just put that out there right now on the outset of our conversation.
Yeah.
We can't change anybody else, right? Yeah. But when we start to notice things we would like to change in that person, how easy it is then to start noticing everything else. And especially if they've heard, like if we're in a relationship or in a season where people are hurt and things have happened and we started to notice, hey, I don't like that about you, or this needs to change and whatever, how that flow-on effect is you suddenly really don't like a whole lot about that other person.
And you suddenly start noticing all the other people that don't have that same issue. Like, I wish you could be more like so-and-so, which is just toxic.
Yeah, and I think it's not helpful. And the moment, and it reminds me of, like a magnet.
Yeah.
The moment that we start to see and dislike things in somebody, it's like we start to repel and we start to pull away from.
Yeah.
And that becomes, for me, and what I've noticed in my life and I've noticed in people that I've journeyed with, that it becomes a really dangerous place, because once we start noticing everything that we struggle with another person, that becomes a dangerous place, because then we forget the things that we do like in that person. We lose sight of those things.
Yeah.
And we're just pulling further and further away.
And, as you're sharing that, I was listening to a really interesting sermon by Bill Johnson the other day, and he was sharing that, because when we're in that kind of place, what happens is we fault finding, and we tend to grumble and complain and moan. And he was sharing that when we grumble and moan and complain, our brain distorts the story.
Yeah.
And so, the things that are irritating to us just get blown up and magnified, and that's all we can see, and the story becomes distorted. And you are right, so that being in that season of the magnets are repelling, it is a pretty dangerous place to be, because the story gets distorted.
Yeah, and bigger.
Yeah.
So it's distorted, but it's what you focus on. So if what we're focusing on is all these negative parts, and it's distorted, it becomes bigger and bigger. That whole making a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah.
So what could be something really small to start with, it becomes distorted and much larger than life. And so then we find ourselves like, hey, we're expecting a great year for 2025.
And as you're sharing this, I'm thinking, gosh, it's quite a miracle
Yes.
that we have you now really in a good place at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think I'm just so grateful for my own coaching journey and what I've learned in choosing to, what to focus on and choosing. And I mean, I don't get it right every time for sure, but choosing to see what I do have and to find, what we can laugh about. I mean, laughter is such a good, it's
good for the soul.
It's good for the soul for sure.
Yeah.
And also just a heads up that you and I are talking about potential difficult seasons in a marriage. We're not talking about mental health issues or domestic violence issues.
No.
So if you're in one of those kinds of relationships
where you're at risk. Yeah, we're not sitting here wanting to laugh about and find the good things in, that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
And the conversation we're having today is to go, okay, what does it look like to potentially turn that magnet around instead of repelling from each other and noticing all the negative things, all the things we don't
irritable
like,
and prickly,
and because we know if we're starting to grumble and be prickly, we're going to look prickly.
I don't want to look prickly.
My face looks prickly. My eyes probably will look prickly. My mouth will probably look. And we don't want that. We want to go, okay, well, what can it look like? How do we flip that? What's the opposite of that?
I love your magnet story because then what you're really asking is what can it look like to attract your magnets again, so and it's so tell me, Elle, what can that look like?
Yeah, and so here's the thing that I've noticed is nothing that we're going to talk about today is going to be the flick of the switch that suddenly changes everything overnight. Things take time. If we've created in a relationship a space where all we're noticing is negative or all we've become aware of and all that's become the norm is a negative form in our relationship, it's going to take some time to notice the things that we need to notice and to re-engage.
Yeah.
So please hear us. We're not saying, just do this, that and the other and everything's going to be magical. But what I've noticed is to be intentional and physically, I see, leaning toward that person. Yeah. So if we've got a relationship where we've known we've sort of been repelled but we want to restore it and we want to engage and we want to have a great 2025, to be intentional to lean towards somebody firstly means noticing some good things in that person.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think as I'm hearing you share, I'm also realizing it's shifting the focus from definitely, what's wrong with the other person to, what can I be grateful for, what's right with them, or what am I happy for, or, but it's also, instead of being so focused on trying to change the other person, it's looking at myself.
Yeah.
And going, what role have I got to play in this?
100%.
And if I was to lean in, what does that even look like? Because again, we shared last week that might look like something different for each of us.
And I guess it would depend on what the stories are. So you're talking before about how the story becomes distorted, and that's because all of our thoughts are in our head and they're circling and they're spiraling. And for me to begin to lean in towards somebody else and to see a different perspective, sometimes it's getting those thoughts out.
Yeah.
Not necessarily with that person, perhaps with a dear friend, perhaps with a coach, someone trusted, and go, this is what I'm, and sometimes just voicing it, you go, oh, that's what I'm thinking. Wow.
Yeah.
And, once that's out or once it's written, journaling is powerful because when it's written and you look back and go, oh, my goodness, I actually was thinking that, that's not actually what I mean,
Yeah, and I love what you said about sharing with a friend. And I think what we've got to be careful of as women, this has been, I've had seasons in my life with certain friends in certain stages, and I'm specifically thinking back to, when the kids are really little and younger. It's so easy to then have these conversations with other friends who are in a similar position, and it's just to be mindful that you can fuel each other's stories too.
I remember hearing though, when you go to playgroup
Yeah.
When you're a young mum and you're at playgroup and there's all the other young mums and they're talking about sleep and then husband's not doing this, that and the other, and absolutely everyone just encouraged each other to bash on their poor husbands.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful. That's completely unresourceful.
Yeah, no, completely. And so,
Very
you know, if
harmful.
you're listening to this, if you do need to go and speak to someone, it's helpful just to be wise about who you're choosing to speak
Yes.
to, that are not going to fuel
Yeah.
the prickliness and the, you know, the
Yeah.
frustration, but can be a mirror.
Yeah.
And ask questions like, okay, so what does leaning in look like? You know, I love that question.
Yeah. And I think you're right, it will look different for different people. And for me, automatically, you know, my beautiful daughter-in-law said something beautiful this week, and we're just sharing stories about different things. And she goes, wow, that really makes me appreciate Aaron more. When she
Yeah.
heard some of his stories and she's realised who the man that he is today, she was able to go, oh, I like my dad-in-law even more now, you
Isn't
know.
that beautiful?
And for
Yeah.
me to be her mother-in-law, but to also be the wife, I was like, yeah, it really does, doesn't it? And so to see my husband through the eyes of somebody else as well, who just thinks the world of him, gee, that's really nice too. So I think it's so important who we surround ourselves with.
Yeah.
That helps us have a great perspective and to see, even sometimes with fresh eyes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
We need to see.
Because another person's set of eyes would be fresh. Yeah. Another thing I'm just thinking of as you're chatting that has really helped me to lean in. And it's not been that's what I've been trying to do. It's just happened. Is when I've looked back at old photographs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, picking out, you know, looking back over moments of, you know, like Greg and the boys. And I remember I had a friend who always used to say to me, oh, you're so lucky, because whenever Greg looks at you, you know, he just loves you so much. And I remember thinking, oh, I don't know. Like, what are you talking about? You know, it's like, but looking back at old photos now and looking at just the, facial expression or the tenderness in a body language, or, you know, the lean, how, you know, a man with his kids, I mean, boy, watching that relationship just warms my heart.
Yeah.
And so again, choosing, you know, where can you go that you can remember the good, because sometimes we just need reminding.
Yeah, we need reminding of the stories that are really loving stories and resourceful stories that will stir our heart to want to lean towards even more.
And as you were sharing earlier, you know, often in relationships, it's these different seasons.
Yeah.
And so when you're in a prickly season, is, you know, remembering back to a good season and what were the qualities of, you know, that person, and because it's the same person.
Yeah, agreed. In the Theodore book that we wrote last year, there's this little story and talk about eyes, connection with eyes, and I love that you shared that other people could see Greg's love for you, the way he looked at you and looks at you. That's how I knew my husband loved me right at the very beginning. Is the way and I shared the story in the book, and I just remember him, we were playing cards, and the way he looked over the cards, and I was like, oh. And it's so easy now in the busyness of life to miss that.
Yes.
And maybe it's not always there now as well.
Absolutely.
You know, it swaps
you know,
and
that's
changes.
real, yeah.
But when we pause for a moment and we remember it and then we look for it, remember we spoke about last week how our brain looks for evidence.
Yes.
So if we've got a relationship that's prickly and we're telling ourselves, oh, you know, we're having a rough time, maybe you're saying all sorts of things about your spouse and you're spiraling, your brain's looking for all the evidence. So it will notice the shortness in the tone. It will notice how they've turned and walked away. It'll notice. However, the moment we start to look for the love and the positives, our brain is looking as well, and it will start to notice the eyes that still do have a little twinkle. It will notice the pleasant tone. It will notice the opening of the gate.
Yeah, and on that note also, I think, you know, to remember that if, like, let's say I've been in a season where I've been super uber prickly, you know, and I've really been pressing all Greg's wrong buttons, and he's thinking, boy, oh boy,
my goodness,
you know, how do I deal with this woman? You know, I might not see that look of love in his eyes for
No.
me, because I've been all
You've been
really
prickly.
prickly, And so sometimes we as much as what we can be on the lookout for those things, I think it's also to remember that we mirror each other, and there's a lot of neuroscience around mirroring.
Yeah.
And so if I've been prickly, there's quite a good chance that perhaps your hubby's been a bit prickly too, So again, what can I do? What's my role to play? So even if I decide, well, I haven't seen those eyes for a while, but I'm going to actually look at him with those eyes.
How are you doing?
But then, our human nature is to mirror.
Yeah.
So I remember hearing once, I can't even remember who said it, but someone was saying, be the kind of person you want someone else to be towards you.
We did this in a podcast last year.
Is that where I've heard it? Oh, but
I'm sure someone better than us said it too.
Oh, gosh.
But no, that's funny. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but it is. It's just that whole, again, how do we lean in? It's like, okay, well, I can choose to, if whatever I'm needing Greg to be for me, well, let me start by trying to
Being
be
that
that for
first?
him. Yeah.
Agreed. I remember years ago, it must have been very early in our marriage. I was reading a book about, I don't know, being a good wife or whatever. But I remember it talking about that sort of be and do and take that first step. And I remember thinking, well, that's not very fair. I don't like, why should I be?
Yeah, the one to stick something in my mouth and keep my mouth shut.
That's right. Why should it be me? And, I think over the years I've realised some of the reason why it should be me, because I want a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
I want my husband to want me and to love me, and so if it takes me doing something, then hello, I'm going to do it.
And I remember as a season, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, I think it was still, a couple of years ago, but I remember, and I think it was, doing all this coaching work and becoming much more self-aware.
Yeah.
I remember Greg and I had a conversation that I was a bit grumpy about something, and I'd said something. And I remember him walking away, and I remember thinking to myself, gosh, listening back to myself, like I wasn't sounding like the person I want to be at all.
No.
And realizing, gosh, there have been seasons in our life where he's had to put up with quite a lot. And so why shouldn't it be me to change?
Why shouldn't it be?
Yeah.
And that's a really good question. When we start to think, oh, why me? Why not me?
Yeah.
Why shouldn't it be? Why? And sometimes it's a bit further, and sometimes we're not going to really want to do it, but like what an honour that it gets to be me sometimes.
Yeah.
None of us are perfect, but I know that if I want 2025 to be a year where I am looking to live my best life, I want to show up as a great wife for my husband.
Yeah, and looking to be loved and to be blessed and to have their favour.
Yes.
It's like, if we can be that for them, then that's what we're going to get back. Yeah.
Yeah, and not saying it's easy necessarily, and we are all in different seasons. However, if it's an encouragement to you today to look at how can you, for 2025, be intentional in your closest, nearest and dearest relationships. What would it look like if to flick over that magnet, if you've been repelling away from somebody that you care for, what could it look like to turn it around, to start to magnetize towards that person? What could you do?
Yeah, and it may take a while for them
to see the fruit.
To see the fruit, for sure. But it's amazing how when something on the inside of you shifts, when you do that sort of switch in your mind, and you start leaning in and you start noticing what you love about them and what's good and how you enjoy being with them. You
start bringing your best self.
I love it.
Awesome. Well, here's again to a great year and to being really intentional with our most precious relationships.
And again, if you're struggling with this area and, if you are concerned about mental health issues or domestic violence issues, please find whoever is in your area that you need to speak to. But if you're struggling in the day-to-day of your relationships, we would love to have you in our membership. We have these kinds of conversations in our group coaching, and this is part of real life, and relationships are
they're
kind
there
of thing.
every day.
They're there every day, and they're the kind of thing that need intentional work on every day. And we'd love to hear from you and support you and be with you through yours. So.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Come on in. Check out the link. It's attached to this conversation. And we're always better together. There's something about sharing stories, learning to have a bit of a laugh with each other, at each other sometimes. In love, though, and encouraging each other on the journey. So,
Thanks, Al. See you
Excellent.
next time.
Bye.